Marvel Comics once again find themselves under the microscope being accused of anti-Semitic imagery in one of the recent comic books, Daredevil #1 by Saladin Ahmed and Aaron Kuder. We do have the full story, the accusations being levied out by several rabbis and scholars. We actually have a rebuttal from Aaron Kuder, the artist himself, as well as some of the history of Marvel Comics with anti-Semitic imagery, especially recently. These have happened within the last 10 years or whatever. And me personally, I'm a huge Daredevil fan. I really like the character. But once they put Saladin Ahmed on the book, number one, he's extraordinarily average on his best day and quite incomprehensible on his worst day as a writer. So why would I want to read that? But also, it feels like Marvel Comics violated their own hiring practices, putting Saladin Ahmed on the Daredevil book. Daredevil has some pretty distinct characteristics. He is Catholic, he's white, he's also blind. To my knowledge, Saladin Ahmed is none of those things. So I was like, why the hell is this guy on the book? If you can't find a Catholic blind writer to write Daredevil, like what the hell are you doing, Marvel Comics? You set all these precedents. Or perhaps it's not a hard, fast rule. Maybe it's just a rule for certain other characters that represent certain other things. Apparently, if you have a Catholic character, it's okay to put somebody like Saladin Ahmed on the book. And not surprisingly, an accusation like this would have actually come out at probably the worst time possible, and definitely a tip of the cap to the Popverse for even publishing this article. It's not the best time in the world for Marvel to have these accusations levied against them. They're probably not going to get a whole lot of headlines. There's some pretty disgusting things going on out there in the world right now, and I imagine Marvel wishes they weren't a part of this spotlight. Obviously, they're not a main part of it, but this is coming on the periphery, and it certainly doesn't help their public image or any of that stuff right now. But let's listen to the details and what people are saying about Daredevil #1 from writer Saladin Ahmed as well as artist Aaron Kuder. On Friday, several Jewish rabbis, professors, and interfaith scholars condemned the depiction of the new villain in Saladin Ahmed and Aaron Kuder's Daredevil #1 as anti-Semitic. Malka Z. Simkovich, director of Catholic Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, points to the villain's hooked nose and beard, as well as the weathered and wrinkled forehead and horns, as suggestive of a demonic rabbi. She also notes that the fact that Matt Murdock, who is now a Catholic priest, is fighting the demon off with a cross only deepens the problems. This illustration draws from an ancient tradition of demonizing Jews in literature and art to portray a clash between good and evil, said Simkovich. Philip A. Cunningham, director of the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph University, echoes Simkovich's comment, saying, "When I first saw the illustration of Daredevil's opponent in this new iteration of the comic book hero, I was immediately struck by his resemblance to posters advertising a Nazi propaganda film called Der Ewige Jude, also known as The Eternal Jew." There are definitely some similarities between what was being depicted in that Nazi propaganda poster promoting the film as to what you actually see in the interiors of the comic book itself. It's very, very similar. And if you look at the details associated with the villain himself, it certainly looks like what is described as being anti-Semitic imagery when it comes to Jewish people and rabbis and stuff is definitely there. Now, was it intentional? I'm not really sure. I would actually have to see the script. Perhaps Saladin Ahmed put in there that he wanted the villain to have like a hook nose, that he wanted the villain to have a big beard and all that stuff. How much of it was a creative choice by Aaron Kuder himself, and how much of it was dictated by the author himself? Now, obviously, we don't have that, and I don't imagine Marvel Comics are just going to go out of their way to kind of dime out their creative team here, and they'll probably do the best that they can to kind of circle the wagons. I don't imagine that they want to go out there and say that, yes, our first lead Muslim writer on Daredevil decided to include anti-Semitic imagery in the very first issue of his Daredevil run. I imagine that's a headline that C.B. Cebulski, Tom Brevoort, and the rest of the brain trust at Marvel Comics realize that they don't actually want to have run with. So without that amplifying information, it's tough to make a definitive conclusion regarding the imagery itself, but it certainly fits in the parameters of what has been described as anti-Semitic imagery over the years. There's also a little bit more to this as well. Alongside his initial portrayal in Daredevil #1 as an older bearded white man in a dark suit, the unnamed adversary is at times depicted as an enormous head on the body of the new Daredevil, Elektra. In the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust 2020 report on anti-Semitic tropes, the image of an exaggeratedly large Jewish man's head, often but not always placed on the body of an animal, occurs repeatedly. Rabbi A. James Rudin, recently awarded a knighthood by Pope Francis for his work in advancing Jewish-Catholic relations, calls the images repulsive. And that one is absolutely right inside there. There's actually multiple pages of that, where you can see that this new villain's head is absolutely enormously large. It's got the big beard, it's got the hook nose, it's got the big horns coming out, and it's certainly sitting right on top of the head of Elektra as she haunts the dreams, I guess, of Matt Murdock. And it's, I want to believe that nobody was doing this on purpose. I want to believe that Marvel isn't a company that really promotes anti-Semitism with the imagery. But once you start reading into some of this stuff and the descriptions of what anti-Semitism looks like in an illustration, like it's kind of damning that they're so on the nose. I think it would actually be like difficult to just like in your own mind's eye, create something that's synonymous with anti-Semitism. Saladin Ahmed wrote the comic book, but he didn't illustrate it. He did not illustrate this villain. It was actually done by Aaron Kuder, and this is what he had to say. Daredevil artist Aaron Kuder insists his depiction of the villain is not meant to be anti-Semitic. The accusations, he says, are completely laughably insane and extremely and utterly insulting. Now, me personally, I can understand why Aaron Kuder would say that this is extremely insulting or utterly insulting, or perhaps even extremely and utterly insulting. If this was original work that he had just created with no influence from anybody, it probably would be insulting to him as an artist to say that perhaps you have some anti-Semitism sitting in the back of your mind. But to say that these accusations are completely laughably insane, I think is a bit too far, because if you look at the imagery that he's created, it's basically kind of textbook anti-Semitism when it comes to iconography associated with anti-Semitism, specifically rabbis. So it's not completely laughably insane. It's actually the textbook definition. Now, I guess the big question is, was Aaron Kuder influenced to create the villain that way? Or maybe perhaps he has some type of, what do they call it? Internalized anti-Semitism? I mean, they actually talk about it in the article, and that's one of the things that these rabbis and these scholars are talking about, is once these images get out there and they're so pervasive, you don't even realize that you're consuming anti-Semitic images. You don't even realize that you're producing anti-Semitic images. It's kind of all been ingrained in your mind as that's what the face of evil looks like. And I imagine Aaron Kuder, if he did create this with no influence from anyone on the outside, wasn't trying to actually create anti-Semitic imagery. But it could be a pretty damn good example that you don't even know it anymore. It's been so ingrained in your mind and so accepted that this is the face of evil that to continue propagating it, he didn't even have to think about it. It wasn't a conscious choice anymore, which I think is really interesting, especially when you listen to what these people had to say about anti-Semitism and the way it's depicted in fiction and whatnot. As we know, anti-Semitic artwork has appeared in a number of other Marvel comics in recent years, including X-Men Gold #1, 2017, and Immortal Hulk #43 in 2021. Simkovich argues that even presented unintentionally or received without awareness, this kind of imagery extends the reach of anti-Semitism. So this is something that Marvel Comics has been accused of in the past 6 years twice. Now, I think we can all agree that there's no doubter when it comes to X-Men Gold #1. I mean, that artist was fired, has never worked at Marvel Comics again, and it's an absolute no-doubter that what that artist included in X-Men Gold #1 was anti-Semitic. The other issue in question before this, Immortal Hulk #43, Joe Bennett, the artist at the time, said, "I was writing the words backwards because they're on the inside of the building," and he accidentally left out the L to where it spelled jewelry instead of jewelry, which happens to be the exact same word that the artist who completely was anti-Semitic placed into X-Men Gold #1. Is that a coincidence? Is it not a coincidence? I do not know. I can absolutely see how you could make that mistake if you're an artist. Even somebody as talented and proficient and professional and long-standing as far as a professional comic book artist like a Joe Bennett could make that mistake. And once again, we're experiencing these accusations against Marvel Comics. And when you look at the people that were assisting Saladin Ahmed and Aaron Kuder on this book, Tom Groneman, I believe, is the assistant editor. Devin Lewis is the editor. And C.B. Cebulski is the EIC. Those are the only names associated with the editorial team behind this. They have to start taking some of this blame on themselves, specifically C.B. Cebulski. That's why you have an editorial staff to where if you make a creative choice or an artistic choice, you can go, hey, when you look at this, I don't think that's what you meant to do, but it could be perceived this way. Why don't we go a different direction with this? But these guys are so busy playing Sudoku and Wordle, they don't actually have the time or expertise or, professionalism to spot when you have such clear-cut anti-Semitic imagery within the comic book itself. to where even if it wasn't intentional, it was certainly going to be offensive to people once they saw what this villain was all about and the way that he was being portrayed. And the fact that it had so many hallmarks of anti-Semitic imagery associated with it, this is an absolute failure on C.B. Cebulski, Devin Lewis, probably Tom Groman as well, even though he's an assistant editor. And Marvel Comics needs to start taking a look in the mirror. Are they an anti-Semitic publisher? I mean, 3 accusations in a 6-year time period. You know, it's starting to get serious, and it's not looking good for them. And this is certainly not a time where I imagine they want their reputation associated with this kind of iconography or imagery and things like that. So I think it's pretty serious stuff. I definitely want to hear from you guys. Do you think that Aaron Kuder was going out of his way to be anti-Semitic with his imagery? Do you think that Saladin Ahmed, the writer, perhaps played a part in this? Maybe it's a C.B. Cebulski thing. Or is it nothing at all? Are we just reading into something that, you know, perhaps it could be taken that way, but it certainly was never intended that way? Definitely want to hear from you guys and what you think is going on here. And I definitely want to point out what a failure, a monumental failure C.B. Cebulski is. I actually made this video 4 years ago. And when you go back and watch this, remember, this is 4 years ago, and this moron has the exact same problems to this day, and I do not know how he's still in charge of Marvel Comics. Definitely watch this video here. There's also a link in the video description.